He was just a 5-year-old boy, small hands, muddy shoes, heart full of wonder. But what he saw beneath that crumbling old bridge would haunt anyone. A massive German shepherd, dangling by a single paw above a raging river. The dog's eyes, wide with terror, locked onto the boy's. One wrong move, and it would all be over. But what this child did next stunned the world. Would you risk your life for a creature no one else would save? Bozeman, Montana, a quiet mountain town nestled beneath the snow-dusted peaks of the Gallatin Range, wore the soft hush of early autumn like a memory. The trees lining the western edge of town flamed gold and crimson, their leaves flickering in the crisp breeze that swept in from the forest. Clouds hung low that afternoon, heavy with the scent of approaching rain, while the sun, reluctant and pale, cast long, slanted beams across the woods. Callan Winslow, 6 years old, wandered beyond the familiar edges of his grandmother's backyard, rubber boots squelching through patches of damp moss. He was a thin child, all elbows and knees, with wheat blonde hair that curled at the nape of his neck, and a scattering of freckles across his nose. His eyes, wide, gray-blue, and always searching, seemed too thoughtful for his age, shaped by grief far earlier than life intended. His mother, Julia Winslow, had died in a sudden car accident just 8 months ago. Since then, the boy had lived with his grandmother Mavis in a weathered, clapboard house on the edge of town, where silence pressed against the windows like snow. Callan didn't speak much anymore, not because he couldn't, but because the words had dried up after the funeral, retreating somewhere inside him where even Mavis couldn't reach. Instead, he wandered. The woods behind the house were his refuge, a place where the birds didn't ask questions, and the trees whispered stories that didn't need endings. Mavis Winslow, a woman of sturdy frame and quiet strength, had once been a nurse at the local clinic. Her hair was silver but thick, pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, and her face bore the kind of lines that only come from hard years and fierce love. She had raised 2 daughters alone, Julia and her older sister Caroline, after her husband's heart gave out one cold February night. Mavis didn't believe in complaints or weakness. She believed in hot soup, good boots, and facing the world head-on, even when it shattered you. That day, she stood at the kitchen window slicing carrots, her back aching in the way it always did before the rain. She believed Callan was in the backyard, collecting sticks or building another moss fort behind the shed. She didn't see him slip past the fence, the curiosity in his chest too big for fences and fears. Callan wandered deeper into the woods, the air growing colder as the wind stirred the canopy. He followed the faint path of a deer trail until the trees thinned, and he found himself staring at something forbidden, something he'd only seen from the second-story bedroom window: the old railway bridge. It stretched across a chasm carved by the Gallatin River, a structure of rusted iron and rotting wood, long since abandoned by the logging trains of generations past. His mother had once warned him never to go near it. "That bridge," she'd said, "is tired and angry. It'll take you if you let it." But children remember warnings the way dreams remember sunlight, flickering, fragile things that vanish in the face of wonder. Callan edged closer, heart fluttering, the wind louder now as it rushed through the ravine. As he approached the bridge, a sound halted him, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind or the river's growl, a whimper, then another, sharp and desperate. He froze. "Hello?" he called, voice timid and cracking. The sound came again, this time clearer, pleading. Callan stepped onto the bridge, his small hands gripping the rusted railing as he crept forward. The wood groaned under his weight, boards missing in wide gaps that revealed the frothing waters 30 feet below. Then he saw it. Through one of the gaps in the planks, hanging beneath the bridge by a single rear paw, was a dog. Not just any dog, a German shepherd, massive and trembling, its black and tan fur soaked and matted with dirt. One leg hooked awkwardly through a splintered beam, its body swinging with each gust of wind. Its eyes, dark, glassy, and filled with panic, locked onto Callan's, and in them he saw not just fear, but a desperate plea. The dog didn't bark. It didn't snarl. It only stared, silently begging. Callan's heart slammed in his chest. He dropped to his knees, pressing his face between the boards, reaching as far as he could. "I'll help," he whispered, the words coming without thought. But his fingers couldn't reach. He looked around frantically. To the left, a thin ledge ran the length of the bridge, likely once used for maintenance. Narrow and slick with moss, it clung to the outer frame of the structure like a forgotten promise. He hesitated only a moment before crawling to the edge and stepping onto it, knees trembling. The wind pushed against him. He clung to the rail, inching forward, every footfall a battle between courage and common sense. Below, the dog whimpered again. When he reached the point directly above the animal, he lay flat on the ledge and lowered himself, arms stretching downward until his shoulders screamed. His fingers brushed coarse fur. He shifted, risked more of his weight, then grabbed a handful of wet scruff. "Hold on," he grunted. At that moment, the dog's paw slipped. The full weight of the German Shepherd dropped into Callan's arms, jerking him downward with such force that his body smacked the bridge's edge. Pain shot through his side, but he held on, teeth gritted, small muscles straining with everything he had. The dog didn't fight. It went still, letting him pull, letting him save it. It took all his strength, but inch by inch he managed to lift the animal, using the rusted support to wedge himself upright. When the dog's front paws found footing on the ledge, it scrambled up beside him, panting hard, sides heaving. Callan collapsed beside it, arms trembling, tears on his cheeks. He didn't know why he was crying. Maybe relief, maybe awe. The dog lay still for a moment, then cautiously leaned its head against Callan's shoulder. Up close, it was clear this was no ordinary stray. The dog was older, perhaps 6 or 7 years, with intelligent eyes and a powerful build, despite the ribs showing through its fur. Around its neck was a collar unlike any Callan had seen, metallic, with a small scratch device attached. No tags, no name. "You're hurt," Callan whispered. He reached out, gently brushing the fur away from the animal's leg. Blood, dark and sticky, stained the fur near the paw. The injury looked raw, possibly dislocated, maybe worse. He sat there with the dog until the clouds above finally broke, rain falling in a soft, steady curtain. The wind died down. The forest hushed. "I'll call you Arlo," Callan said at last, the name tumbling out from a memory of a book his mother used to read. "You look like an Arlo." The dog didn't move, just closed his eyes, still breathing hard, his body leaning into the small boy who had pulled him from the edge. They stayed like that for a long while, until the trees blurred and the sky darkened. And somewhere beyond the forest, the world went on not knowing what had just been saved. The rain had stopped by morning, but the chill clung to Bozeman like a ghost that wouldn't let go. Mist hovered low above the dewy fields, drifting between the pines that bordered Mavis Winslow's old property like silent sentinels. The clouds still pressed heavy against the sky, threatening another downpour. In the backyard, the grass was slick, dotted with puddles and fallen leaves, and the air held that scent of wet earth and pine sap that only the Montana woods could offer. Callan's boots squished with every hurried step as he led Arlo, now limping heavily, around the side of the barn. The dog moved with effort, favoring his rear leg, but made no sound. He followed Callan with a quiet obedience that felt less like training and more like shared understanding. Despite the pain, Arlo's gaze never left the boy. Behind the barn sat an old tool shed, long unused. Once painted red, the planks had faded to a muted rose, the corners eaten by time and termites. A padlock hung broken from the door, snapped in a storm years ago and never replaced. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. Broken chairs, bundles of twine, and forgotten crates lined the walls. In the far corner, beneath a cracked window, lay a pile of old blankets and hay, dry enough for a temporary bed. Callan guided Arlo inside, coaxing him down gently onto the softest part of the pile. The dog let out a breathy sigh and laid his head on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Rain pattered faintly on the roof. The boy sat beside him, staring at the strange collar circling Arlo's neck. It wasn't made of leather or nylon like most dog collars. This one was thick, metallic, matte black, with a rectangular box affixed to one side and no name tag, only small letters etched into its surface. Most of them were scratched out, but one word remained partly legible: Sentinel. Callan's small fingers traced the grooves with curiosity. He didn't know much about military things, but even he could tell this wasn't ordinary. As he looked closer, he noticed a tiny panel on the side of the device, covered with what looked like dried mud and maybe blood. He reached toward it, but Arlo let out a low growl, not threatening, but clearly uncomfortable. Okay, Callan whispered, pulling back. Not yet. At that moment, a voice echoed from the backyard. Callan! It was Mavis. Callan's heart jumped. He hadn't told her about Arlo. He couldn't. Not yet. He stood quickly and peeked through the cracked boards. Mavis was standing on the porch, arms crossed over her flannel shirt, eyes scanning the trees. She looked worried, but not panicked yet. I'm coming, Callan called, voice cracking. He turned back to Arlo, who was now watching him closely. I'll come back, he promised. Stay quiet. He pulled the door shut and jogged toward the house, heart hammering. Meanwhile, across town in the Bozeman Gazette office, a squat two-story brick building on Main Street, Elliot Rhodes sat hunched over a cluttered desk, scanning a row of grainy photographs. He was in his late 30s, lean and sharp-angled, with short, messy brown hair and the kind of green eyes that always looked like they were about to ask a question you didn't want to answer. He wore a threadbare tweed jacket and black jeans, and a pen was always tucked behind his ear. Once a promising national correspondent in Chicago, Elliot had burned out early. The combination of corruption, red tape, and one very public ethics scandal sending him back to his hometown. But Bozeman didn't mean retirement. It meant second chances. Recently, he'd stumbled onto something strange. Military K-9S disappearing from bases around the region. First, it was listed as retired early, then transferred. But then one was found dead in a creek near Missoula, another turned up in an abandoned warehouse in Idaho, barely alive. Now a third was missing, and no one was talking. Elliot tapped the side of his mug, eyes lingering on a photo of a dog in a military vest. German Shepherd, black and tan, intelligent eyes. The name Sentinel S7 was visible on the faded tag. The report had said it was decommissioned, but no paperwork matched. He leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Where are you, S7?" Back at the Winslow property, Callan finished breakfast under the quiet scrutiny of Mavis. She sat across from him, sipping coffee, her silver hair damp from stepping outside. Her gaze lingered on the mud on his boots. "Where'd you go this morning?" she asked, voice low and gravelly from years of cigarette smoke and long shifts. Callan hesitated. "Just the trees." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "You didn't go near that old bridge, did you?" Callan shook his head, too fast. "Because if I find out you did—" "I didn't!" he blurted, then dropped his eyes to the bowl of oatmeal. Mavis didn't press further. Not yet. Later that afternoon, while she napped in her chair with the local radio humming static, Callan snuck back out to the shed. Arlo was awake, but still lying down. He wagged his tail once when Callan entered. "I brought food," Callan whispered, pulling a peanut butter sandwich from his pocket. The dog sniffed it, then ate slowly, carefully. Callan also brought a small metal bowl with water from the spigot. Arlo drank like he hadn't had anything in days. As Callan sat beside him, the dog shifted, revealing a line of scars beneath the thick fur on his side, long, thin, like cuts. Some healed, some still raw. "What happened to you?" Callan murmured. The dog looked up, ears twitching, then gently rested his head against the boy's knee. That evening, a knock came at Mavis's door. She opened it to find Elliot Rhodes standing there, holding a notepad. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said politely. "Elliot Rhodes, Bozeman Gazette. I'm doing a piece on the old rail lines, some of the old structures around Gallatin. Wondering if I could ask a few questions?" Mavis frowned, studying him. "You mean the bridge?" "Yes, ma'am. Curious if anyone's seen anything unusual out there." She shook her head. "Haven't been near it in years. Dangerous, that bridge. Why?" "Just checking leads. Some stories about noises, dogs howling, old gear showing up. Doesn't add up." She crossed her arms. "If this is about those animal control vans I saw last week, you're not the first one snooping." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Animal control vans? Black, no logos. They parked near the South Woods 2 nights in a row. Thought maybe it was bears, but..." She trailed off, watching his expression sharpen. "You see anything else?" he asked. "Nope," she said firmly. "And I think we're done here." He tipped his head. "Appreciate your time." As he turned, he noticed a small figure watching from the upstairs window. A boy, barely more than a shadow. By the third morning since the bridge, a cold front had swept in from the mountains. Frost curled along the edges of the windows in Mavis Winslow's kitchen, turning the glass into a patchwork of icy veins. The sky above Bozeman hung heavy with low-gray clouds that promised snow, far earlier than the calendar would allow. Callan sat at the table in silence, cradling a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm cocoa, his eyes distant and troubled. He couldn't stop thinking about the scars. The day before, while brushing loose twigs and dirt from Arlo's thick fur, he had found the first one, an ugly, darkened line across the German Shepherd's shoulder blade, like something caused by a blade or heated metal. The more he looked, the more he saw. Faint burn marks along the side, circular scars on his back legs, and a dent in the skin around his neck, just beneath the strange collar. Callan didn't know much about cruelty, but he'd heard kids whisper it at school. He knew what pain looked like when it lived beneath the surface. That morning, after Mavis had stepped outside to talk to the postman, Callan slipped out to the shed. Arlo was lying quietly in the same spot, his breathing slower now, his strength returning little by little. He wagged his tail once when he saw the boy, but didn't try to get up. "Hi, buddy," Callan whispered. He knelt beside the dog with a small towel and a warm bowl of water. He dipped the cloth in and began gently cleaning the dirt from Arlo's coat, especially the areas around the scarring. Arlo flinched now and then but didn't growl. In fact, when Callan's fingers brushed one particularly deep scar along his ribs, the dog let out a soft, almost resigned sigh, like someone remembering something they'd tried hard to forget. "You didn't deserve this," Callan murmured. The dog looked up, and for a moment it felt like understanding passed between them. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, in a dusty back room of the Bozeman Gazette office, Elliot Rhodes stared at his laptop screen with the grim focus of a man pulling threads from a tangled web. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled up over lean forearms, coffee gone cold beside him. He had been piecing together dates, shipment logs, and unredacted reports leaked from someone inside a military storage depot in Nevada. That morning, he'd made a breakthrough. The name Cobalt Systems had appeared in a requisition order for military K9 tracking collars, devices that matched the design of the one he'd seen in an archived photo of Sentinel S7, the dog presumed lost. The same model he now confirmed had been contracted for non-standard operations 2 years prior. Elliot knew what that meant. Black budget projects, shadow contracts, no accountability. Cobalt Systems was a privately owned defense technology firm run by a former intelligence officer named Miles Breyer, a name that set off every alarm in Elliot's gut. Breyer had once been involved in a scandal linked to the mishandling of classified data smuggled across borders using drones. It had never been proven, but people in the know whispered that Breyer had moved from drones to something even harder to trace: dogs. "Living couriers," Elliot muttered aloud. He clicked to open a file marked "Whistleblower Testimony, Redacted." Within the scanned documents was a quote: "They implanted the encryption inside the collar and trained the dog to seek only its handler. If the data was intercepted, no one could access it without the code." Elliot sat back, rubbing his temples. If what he was digging into was true, then the missing dogs weren't just abandoned. They were being hunted. And if one had survived, if Sentinel S7 was still alive, someone would want it back. And not for kind reasons. He needed a second opinion. He picked up his phone and called a contact he hadn't spoken to in years. Tess Devereaux, a former Army K9 specialist who now ran a small veterinary clinic on the edge of Belgrade, 20 minutes west of Bozeman. Tess was a woman who lived at the edge of her own patience. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark auburn hair tied in a severe bun, and a jaw that looked like it could break granite, she had a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness. But those who'd served with her knew the truth. She had a soft heart buried beneath layers of gruff silence. Her career had ended after a roadside bomb injured her service dog beyond saving. She never forgave the chain of command that called it a calculated loss. Elliot met her at the back of her clinic, where she was fitting a prosthetic onto a 3-legged Labrador. "Rhodes," she greeted without looking up. "It's been what, 5 years?" "6, Elliot said, watching her deft hands adjust the strap. "I need your help." "You always do." He handed her a printed photo of Arlo's collar from the Sentinel S7 file. Tess squinted, frowned, and then whistled low. "Cobalt prototype. Experimental. I only ever saw one in person. On a dog they wouldn't even let me examine. Said it was above clearance." Why? Because I think one of those dogs made it out. Tess looked up sharply. Alive? I think so. I think he's in Bozeman. You think, she said slowly, or you know. I've got a strong hunch. Tess folded her arms. Then find him fast. Because if he's wearing one of those things, someone's tracking him already. They won't stop. Back at the Winslow shed, Callan watched as Arlo finally stood to stretch, limping still but with more confidence than before. The dog sniffed the air, ears twitching. Then he moved toward the far wall of the shed and began scratching at the boards. Not aggressively, but methodically. Callan followed, confused, and noticed something. Behind the loose board was a plastic tarp covering a stack of old crates. When he pulled it away, he found something stranger still. An Army-issued medkit, weathered and half-used, tucked between tools and a rusted shovel. It must have belonged to Grandpa Winslow from his Vietnam days, Callan thought. But why would Arlo know to go there? The boy opened the kit and found gauze, tape, and an old metal syringe without the needle. Arlo pawed once at the kit, then looked back at Callan. You knew it was here? The boy whispered. Arlo sat. As the first snowflakes began to fall outside, soft and uncertain, Callan realized this dog hadn't just escaped something. He had survived something calculated, something terrifying. And now someone would be looking for him. The first snow didn't stick, but it coated the world in silence. Bozeman's air grew colder, heavier, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The days shortened, and by 5 in the afternoon, dusk spilled across the mountains like smoke. On the Winslow property, the lights from the house cast long golden streaks across the frost-bitten grass. But farther back, beyond the barn and rusted fence line, the night pressed in thick and watching. Callan didn't tell Mavis about the medkit Arlo had uncovered. Something about it felt secret, like it belonged only to them. He visited the shed as often as he could, bringing food, water, and sometimes just sitting beside Arlo while the wind rustled through the eaves. The dog was recovering quickly now. Though still limping, he had begun to move with quiet precision, his ears always alert, eyes scanning every corner like a soldier on duty. The scars beneath his fur no longer looked like remnants of survival. They looked like a history someone had tried to erase. One night, as the wind howled through the forest and the temperature dipped below freezing, Callan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, covers tucked up to his chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling as the old farmhouse creaked in the cold. Downstairs, Mavis had fallen asleep in her chair again, the radio playing a low country song no one was really listening to. Callan rose silently, padded to the window, and pulled back the curtain just a little. That's when he saw him. A figure stood near the edge of the shed, partially concealed by the skeletal branches of the apple tree. He wasn't moving, not yet, but his posture was too rigid to be casual. Even from a distance, Callan could tell this man was watching the shed. The boy's breath caught. He ducked, heart thudding. Seconds passed. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head and peeked again. The figure was gone. Down in the shed, Arlo had already sensed something. His body had gone stiff, tail rigid, ears pinned back. A deep guttural growl began low in his chest. Not fear, not warning, recognition. He stood and moved to the door, placing one paw against it, then another. He sniffed the crack, growled again. Whoever had been there, he knew them. Miles Breyer had been many things in his life. Army intelligence officer, Black Ops liaison, covert asset handler, but none of those titles described what he had become. A man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair combed back military tight and eyes so pale they looked glassy under light. He wore a black coat zipped up to his neck, leather gloves, and combat boots polished to a silent gleam. His face was unreadable, sculpted by years of knowing how to hide every thought and intention. Breyer wasn't here by accident. He was here for what he considered recovery, retrieving the asset codenamed Sentinel S7, a mission that should have been completed months ago. The moment the encrypted signal had flared up again, brief and faint like a heartbeat on the edge of flatlining, he'd known the dog was alive. And if it was alive, someone had it, and that someone could ruin everything. 15 miles away, Elliot Rhodes sat inside his car parked near a ridge overlooking a field station, once used by forest rangers. He was meeting a contact who promised intel on Cobalt systems. The cold seeped through his jacket, but he didn't turn the engine on. He waited, hand hovering near the recorder in his coat pocket. At 9:17 p.m., a figure slid into the passenger seat. She was thin and hunched, wearing a puffy coat several sizes too big. Her name was Marla Boone, early 30s, pale skin, anxious eyes. A former technician at a surveillance center, contracted by cobalt. She'd run when she realized what the collars were truly used for. Marla spoke in quick bursts. They're designed to carry encrypted payloads, audio, images, maps. But there's more. Some of them have dead man switches. If the collar's tampered with, it wipes the data, or worse. Worse? Elliot asked. Her eyes darted toward the dark horizon. Let's just say the animal doesn't survive. Elliot leaned forward. The one they lost, Sentinel S7, what makes him different? He wasn't just a courier, he was bonded. To who? Marla swallowed. Captain Marcus Shaw. He died during a breach operation. Everyone thought the dog died with him. He didn't. Marla's fingers tightened around a flash drive. Then be careful. Cobalt wants that data buried, and they've hired someone off-book to retrieve it. Miles Breyer, Elliot said quietly. Marla nodded. He doesn't ask questions. He erases problems. Back at the Winslow farm, the night stretched deeper, darker. Callan couldn't go back to sleep. Instead, he crept down the stairs, barefoot and trembling, and slipped out the back door. He wrapped his coat tight and ran toward the shed. When he entered, Arlo was pacing. The dog immediately went to him, nosing his leg, then growled again, and turned toward the far wall. He was here, wasn't he? Callan whispered. Arlo's answer was a low, shaking breath. He sat beside the boy, eyes fixed on the corner where the figure had stood. Suddenly the wind shifted. A board creaked outside. They weren't alone. Callan froze. Arlo moved in front of him, body taut, his entire posture protective. Another creak. This time closer. Then silence. Callan slowly reached for the flashlight by the door, but before he could turn it on, Arlo surged forward, barking. A sound like thunder in the stillness. A shout echoed outside, followed by running footsteps disappearing into the woods. The next morning, Mavis found the shed door ajar, and Callan curled up next to Arlo, asleep. She didn't scold him. She just stood there, long gray coat wrapped around her frame, staring at the dog like she was seeing it, really seeing it for the first time. She knelt beside them, laid a hand gently on Arlo's back. He didn't flinch. "Who are you?" she asked softly. The sun rose late that morning, as if reluctant to shine on the frozen tension hanging over the Winslow farmhouse. Frost slicked the windows like a second layer of glass, and the chimney spat pale smoke into the gray Montana sky. Mavis Winslow, up before the birds as always, moved with the slow precision of someone whose joints no longer greeted mornings kindly. She brewed coffee with her usual rhythm, 3 scoops, 1.5 sugars, a generous splash of milk, then leaned against the counter in her worn wool sweater, staring out at the backyard. The shed door was cracked open. It hadn't snowed again overnight, but the frost glinted along the trampled grass where small boots had wandered too many times lately. Mavis narrowed her eyes. Callan had sworn he was just playing out there, but the boy's appetite had changed. His silence is deeper, and she knew his tells, fidgeting with his sleeve, not meeting her eyes, pretending to be hungrier than he really was to get extra food out the door. She'd raised 2 daughters and worked in the ER during Bozeman's worst years. She knew what hiding looked like. She grabbed her coat and gloves, stepped outside, and headed toward the shed. Inside, Callan was kneeling in the hay beside Arlo, humming softly under his breath as he rubbed a warm cloth along the dog's matted fur. The boy had taken to calling it quiet time, the only part of the day where he didn't feel like the world was just waiting to take something else from him. Arlo sat still, his massive head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded in calm contentment. There was no more growling now, no tension in his frame, even when the wind rattled the planks. Only peace. Then the door creaked open. Callan froze. Mavis stepped inside, boots crunching over old straw, and stopped dead as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Her breath caught. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. What in God's name? The dog rose slowly, standing tall between Callan and the door, but not aggressive. His posture was calm, protective, observing. The kind of stillness that unnerved people more than barking ever could. Mavis stared at Arlo, then at her grandson. "Callan Winslow," she said slowly, voice firm but not raised. "You tell me right now what's going on." Callan stood up, trembling. "He was going to die, Grandma. He was hanging from the bridge. I couldn't just leave him." "He's not just some dog, is he?" Callan shook his head. I think he was part of something. Maybe the army. He has this collar." He stepped aside and showed her the strange metal ring around Arlo's neck. "And scars. Lots of them." Mavis's face softened for just a second before she hardened it again. She knelt slowly, one knee cracking loudly as she lowered herself in front of the dog. Arlo didn't move. His eyes followed her hands. He sniffed cautiously as she extended a palm toward his muzzle. He licked it once. Mavis exhaled. "Well, damn it all." Callan waited for the explosion, but it didn't come. Instead, she sat back on the hay bale and rubbed her forehead. "He's staying here?" "Yes," Callan whispered. "Just until he gets better, please." She didn't answer right away. Then she muttered, "This dog better not eat the hens." Later that afternoon, Elliot Rhodes pulled into the gravel driveway of the Winslow farm. He parked his old sedan near the mailbox and took a long breath. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, only that every road led back here. The satellite flare, the van sightings, the reports of someone prowling near the bridge. Too many coincidences clustered around a quiet farmhouse on the edge of the forest. He rang the bell. Mavis answered, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unwelcoming. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Elliot Rhodes. I'm with the Gazette. I remember you from last time. Still chasing that bridge story?" He hesitated. "It's bigger than that now." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not the only one poking around these parts lately. One of them left boot prints out back that don't belong to anyone I know." Elliot's attention sharpened. "You saw someone?" "Didn't see, but my dog did." She watched him carefully as the words left her mouth. "You have a dog?" "I do now." He looked past her toward the barn. "Would it be all right if I asked a few questions?" She sighed. "I'm not hiding anything." "That's what people say when they are," Elliot muttered, then raised a hand. "Sorry, long week." Mavis didn't laugh. "You want to see him?" Elliot nodded. She led him around the side of the property. In the fading light, the shed loomed like something out of a photograph, weathered, soft-edged by time. She opened the door and gestured for him to step in. Arlo stood, alert, between the far wall and the crate where Callan had been reading to him earlier. His fur gleamed darker in the shadows, his collar catching the last rays of sunlight. When Elliot entered, the dog's head snapped toward him. Not in fear, in calculation. Elliot froze. "That's not an ordinary dog." "No," Mavis agreed. "He's something else." Elliot stepped forward slowly, examining the collar. "I've seen this in a government file, a Black Ops prototype, tracking and encryption built into the housing. I know exactly what kind of people want this dog back." Callan appeared behind the dog, arms folded. "You're not taking him." Elliot blinked. "I'm not here to take him. I'm here to protect him." He met Mavis's eyes. "Who found him?" Mavis didn't speak. Callan stepped forward. "I did. He was hanging under the bridge. I saved him." Elliot crouched down, eye level with the boy. "You did something very brave and very dangerous." "He was alone," Callan said quietly. "Like me." That caught Elliot off guard. He stood, eyes lingering on the boy, then looked at Arlo again. "People are coming for him. Dangerous people. I can help, but you need to let me in." Mavis considered him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "We talk tonight. After dark. Inside. No more sheds." The sky split open just after midnight. Thunder rolled low over the Gallatin Range, and a cold, biting rain fell in sheets across the forested fields of Bozeman. The wind screamed through the pine boughs, and every rusted hinge and loose shingle on the Winslow farmhouse groaned in protest. Inside, a small lamp glowed in the living room window, casting shadows over the walls where Mavis, Callan, and Elliot huddled together around a map laid out on the coffee table. Elliot tapped the faded topographical lines. "This ridge here, it drops into a box canyon. If anyone tries to come through the woods behind the house, that's the only way without being seen." Mavis, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, didn't look convinced. "And how do you know so much about this land?" "I was born here," Elliot replied, then added dryly, And I spent 3 summers tracking elk with my grandfather and his bottle of cheap bourbon. I remember the hiding places. Callan sat quietly on the couch beside Arlo, his small fingers buried deep in the dog's thick fur. Arlo was alert again, stiff and ready, eyes on every movement, ears twitching with each gust of wind. The boy could sense the shift in him. This wasn't just fear. It was memory, anticipation, as if Arlo knew this night had been waiting to return. Mavis stood and poured herself a finger of whiskey from a dusty bottle in the kitchen. Let's just pray we're wrong and no one's actually coming. But they were. At 1:07 a.m., the power went out. The house went dark in a single blink. Outside, the wind howled louder. Rain hammered the roof like drum beats. Arlo stood immediately, his body rigid, and emitted a low, guttural growl. Elliot cursed under his breath. They cut the line. What? Mavis asked. They're here. Before anyone could react, a beam of light, flashlight or rifle-mounted, flicked across the side window. Then came the sound of heavy boots splashing in the mud outside. Callan clutched Arlo. We have to run! Elliot reached into his bag and pulled out a small pistol. I'll slow them down. No, Mavis snapped, fire in her voice. We go together. With only seconds to act, they slipped out the back door into the storm. Rain soaked them instantly, cold enough to steal breath. Mavis struggled in the mud, boots sinking into the earth, but Elliot helped her forward. Callan ran ahead, following Arlo, who seemed to know exactly where to go. Behind them, voices shouted, Fan out! Check the barn! Gunmetal silhouettes moved through the mist. A red dot from a laser sight skimmed across the rear shed and vanished into the trees. But Arlo didn't slow. He led them through the side pasture, down a deer trail barely visible even in daylight, his body low, tail straight, every movement purposeful. Callan stumbled once, slipping on wet pine needles, but Arlo circled back and nudged him up with his shoulder. The boy didn't cry. He gritted his teeth and kept running. They moved deeper into the woods until the flashlight beams and distant shouting faded. Elliot turned back once to see one of the men examining the garden gate. He thought he saw a flash of Briar's pale, unreadable eyes behind the scope of a rifle, but then they were gone again, swallowed by trees. For 20 more minutes they ran, soaked and freezing, until Arlo stopped abruptly at a thick wall of underbrush. Without hesitation, he pushed through it with his snout. Beyond, hidden by rock and root, was a narrow opening into the hillside, a shallow cave, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. They entered in silence. Inside, the walls were dry and packed with old leaves. It smelled of stone and faded smoke, like something once used long ago. Arlo sniffed around quickly, then lay near the entrance, body pressed close to the ground, guarding. Where the hell are we? Mavis asked, breathless. Elliot looked around. I think this is one of the old ranger bivouacs, used for overnight patrols years ago. Probably hasn't seen a human since the 90s. Callan touched the stone wall, his teeth chattering. How did Arlo know it was here? Mavis looked down at the dog, who was watching the entrance without blinking. Because this isn't the first time he's been hunted. They waited in the cave until the first hint of dawn bled gray into the sky. Outside, the storm had broken, leaving behind a world soaked and silent. Arlo stood suddenly, sniffed the air, and padded toward a darker corner of the cave. He scratched at the rock until part of it shifted. A second opening, smaller, more concealed. Elliot stepped forward. A back exit? Callan moved beside him, eyes wide. Like a secret tunnel? Arlo sat beside the opening, tail thumping once. Elliot reached in with a flashlight. The tunnel extended for about 20 feet, then sloped down into a narrow pass that led back toward the old trail Elliot had marked on the map. It was the perfect escape route. Smartest damn dog I've ever seen, Elliot whispered. They exited the cave through the tunnel, moving carefully down the slick slope. When they reached a clearing near the ridgeline, they paused to rest. Mavis leaned against a tree, soaked and winded but unbroken. Do you still think we shouldn't keep him? Callan asked, voice quiet. She glanced at Arlo, who was now resting but alert, watching the path behind them. If he hadn't been with us tonight, she said slowly, we wouldn't be here to argue about it. In the distance, a distant bark echoed through the forest. Arlo's ears perked, then relaxed. It wasn't a threat, just the forest waking up again. For now, they were safe. The cabin where they regrouped was little more than a ranger's outpost, forgotten by time. Nestled at the foot of Mount Ellis, surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and covered in a patchy coat of moss and rot, it sat just beyond the county survey lines, off the maps, off the grid. It was cold, the wood stove barely functional, and every window shuttered tight. But it was shelter. Elliot crouched on the creaking floorboards, spreading out the gear he had carried with him through the storm. A compact laptop, an encrypted USB drive, and a field decryption module the size of a paperback book. Callan sat against the wall with a blanket wrapped around him, Arlo resting heavily at his side, eyes on the door as always. Across from Elliot sat Tess Devereaux, the ex-military K-9 specialist he had called for help 2 days earlier. Tess was in her early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered skin that spoke of long days in deserts and storm zones. Her auburn hair was tied in a messy bun under a dark green beanie, and her eyes were a piercing hazel, sharp and suspicious, always calculating risk. After her medical discharge from the Army, she had built a reputation as the go-to fixer for retired service dogs, those deemed too broken to reassign. Arlo had warmed to her quickly. That alone told Elliot she was the right person. Tess examined the collar on Arlo's neck with gloved hands, her brow furrowed. It's one of the early covert relay models, Generation 3A, pre-production. They phased these out after Sentinel-level K9S were deemed too expensive to maintain, too independent. Meaning? Mavis asked from the far end of the cabin, where she sat with a thermos of black coffee. Meaning they trained dogs like Arlo to operate without oversight. Autonomous decision-making, limited verbal command. They were programmed to recognize coded speech and respond to voice prints of one individual only, their assigned handler. Elliot connected the field module to the laptop. Can you bypass that? Not exactly, Tess said, but I can extract the encrypted packet, see what we're dealing with. She inserted a tool into a port concealed beneath Arlo's collar. The dog flinched slightly, but didn't resist. Tess nodded in approval. He's better trained than half the humans I worked with. The module beeped. Got it, Tess whispered, watching the screen come alive with lines of encrypted code and a slowly rising progress bar. Decrypting may take a minute. The room was silent except for the hum of the machine and the pop of the weak fire. Callan rested his head against Arlo's side, fingers tangled in the thick fur behind his ears. Then, suddenly, the screen shifted. A file opened, compressed and encoded with layers of security, but inside were documents, scans, photographs. Tess clicked through one by one, her eyes growing wider. This is not just surveillance, she said. This is active espionage data. Blueprints, names, locations. Elliot leaned in. Who's involved? Tess pulled up a document marked Cobalt Internal Transaction. Project Hermes. At the top of the page, Cobalt Systems Limited, internal routing, Black Tier transfers, recipient, Nayar front, Raven Horizon, Kestrel Solutions. Mavis squinted. None of those sound like governments. They're not, Elliot said grimly. They're private contractors, mercenary networks, some linked to cyber warfare ops in South Asia. Others, like Raven Horizon, have known ties to sanctioned entities. They're selling U.S. surveillance tech? Mavis asked. Elliot nodded. To whoever pays best. Tess sat back slowly. And Arlo was the courier. That's why they didn't track the signal. It was physically encoded into him. Callan looked up. So he was carrying secrets? Elliot's voice softened. The most dangerous kind. Arlo shifted then, lifting his head. His ears perked sharply, his gaze focused not on the door, but on the laptop. Tess noticed it first. He heard something, she said. Elliot replayed a short voice file embedded in one of the documents, most likely an audio command or encryption key. As the low male voice repeated a code phrase in static-filled English, Arlo's body tensed. Then he whined. Pause it, Tess said. Elliot froze the playback. What was the phrase? Mavis asked. Tess replied. Delta 1 verify Gideon. At the sound of the last word, Gideon, Arlo stood completely. His tail was stiff, his body vibrating with sudden recognition. He looked at each person in the room, then barked once, sharp and full of something close to grief. Callan put a hand on his side. You know that name? Tess nodded slowly. That's his handler, Captain Gideon Shaw. He's listed in the K-9 deployment logs, declared KIA 6 months ago. No, Elliot said, scanning the metadata in the audio file. He wasn't. This voice file is recent, dated 3 weeks ago. Mavis stood up, her voice steady. Are you saying Arlo's handler might still be alive? Tess narrowed her eyes. I'm saying someone used his voice. Either he's alive, or someone went to great lengths to make Arlo believe he is. Arlo moved toward the laptop, nudging it gently, then sat, staring at the screen as if waiting for more. What now? Callan whispered. We find Gideon Shaw, Elliot said. And we do it before Briar does, Tess added. Outside, the wind was picking up again, bending the trees and whistling against the cabin's warped siding. The storm may have passed, but a much darker one was gathering on the horizon. By dawn, the clouds had thickened, and a white veil began to descend silently over the Montana wilderness. The snow came soft at first, tiny flakes floating gently onto pine needles and frozen earth, but it carried with it the scent of something heavier, something final. Inside the old ranger cabin, everyone moved with a kind of brittle stillness, like a house of cards that had learned to stand only in the absence of wind. Callan sat by the window, knees pulled to his chest, watching Arlo breathe. The German shepherd's eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He was listening. Always. Snow began to gather on his fur through a broken crack in the wall. Still, he didn't move. Tess packed the last of the equipment into a reinforced field case. She wore a tactical vest over her fleece jacket now, her auburn hair tied back tight. The woman was all edges this morning. Fewer words, more glances. She'd slept in a chair, rifle across her lap, ready for the worst. Elliot was by the radio, attempting to reach a contact from the Department of Homeland Security. No signal, he muttered, pressing the antenna against the window pane. The storm's killing everything. Mavis, who just stoked the fire back to life, sighed. Then we wait. But waiting was never part of Briar's plan. He came not in stealth this time, but in force. At 8:14 a.m., just as the world outside turned completely white, a black SUV rolled silently to a stop just beyond the tree line. Then another, then a third. From each vehicle stepped 2 armed men, dressed in snow camo, eyes hidden behind mirrored goggles. Briar emerged last, wearing a long black trench coat that stood out stark against the snow. His silver hair was untouched by the flakes swirling around him. He moved like he wasn't cold, like nothing could touch him. He raised a hand. The men fanned out. Inside the cabin, Arlo's head snapped up. Tess didn't wait. They're here! She handed Elliot a sidearm, pulled Callan to his feet. You take the rear tunnel with the boy and Mavis. What about you? Elliot asked. I hold the front, buy you time. No chance, Elliot said, jaw tight. We do this together. Tess glanced at him, one hard look that said she didn't expect help, but was glad to get it. She nodded once. Then we hold the cabin. Mavis knelt in front of Callan. You follow Arlo. No matter what happens, you don't look back. Do you hear me? Callan nodded. But what if they catch you? Mavis touched his cheek. They won't. We're too stubborn to die in a snowstorm. The rear tunnel, an old drainage passage beneath the cabin, was narrow and iced over. Arlo led the way, moving fast despite the stiffness in his injured leg. Callan followed, Mavis behind, clutching a flare gun and the case with the decrypted files. Then the gunfire started. Outside, Briar's men approached with military precision. Tess took first shot, controlled and clean, shattering the windshield of the lead SUV and scattering the men behind it. Elliot flanked the side, using the smoke from a fire-started log pile to break visibility. The air filled with the dull thud of suppressed rifles and the sharp echo of return fire bouncing off trees. Briar advanced with his own weapon, a modified Sig Sauer with infrared scope. He never rushed, always walking, methodical. When a shot rang out from the cabin's left side, he didn't flinch. He ducked, rolled, and returned fire with clinical efficiency, hitting a supporting beam and collapsing the outer window. Inside, Tess was breathing hard. A cut bled freely down her temple, but her grip on the rifle was steady. "Elliot!" she shouted. "They're circling!" "I see them!" Elliot ducked, fired twice, then hissed in pain as a bullet grazed his shoulder. He fell back behind the fireplace. Briar kicked down the door. Snow followed him in like smoke. "Sentinel!" he called out. "S7, come home!" But Arlo was gone. Briar's eyes swept the room. Tess rose to fire again. but he kicked the weapon aside with a precise upward blow, sending her crashing into the wall. Elliot tried to lunge forward. Too late. Breyer leveled the gun at Tess's chest. "You should have stayed out of this," he said. Then came a growl from behind. Arlo slammed into Breyer at full speed, teeth bared, fury in motion. The man stumbled, dropped his weapon, and hit the ground hard. Arlo didn't stop. He drove forward, jaws clamping down on Breyer's arm as the man screamed, blood painting the snow-dusted floor. "Arlo!" Callan's voice rang from the tunnel entrance, echoing up into the chaos. "Stop!" At the sound, Arlo paused. His body was shaking, teeth still clenched. He looked back, just once, and released. That was when Breyer pulled a knife from his boot and drove it into Arlo's side. The dog yelped in pain, stumbled back, but didn't fall. Instead, he turned, lips curled, ready to strike again. Before he could, the cabin was flooded with voices and light. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" A squad in DHS insignia stormed through both entrances. Black uniforms, Kevlar vests, weapons raised. The lead man barked orders as Breyer stood frozen, bloodied, knife still in hand. Tess, panting, raised her arm weakly. "He's the one! Miles Breyer, Cobalt Systems." Breyer sneered. "You have no idea what you've ruined." "Actually," said a voice from the tunnel, "we do." Mavis stepped into view, her coat dusted with snow, flare gun in one hand, evidence case in the other. Behind her, Callan stood holding Arlo's head gently in his lap, pressing his small hand over the bleeding wound. "He saved us," the boy said quietly. "You heard him." Breyer was cuffed and dragged outside. Elliot collapsed into a chair, eyes dazed. Tess dropped beside him. "Remind me," she said breathlessly, "why we do this." "Because of kids like him," Elliot muttered. Outside, as the snow turned the battlefield into a quiet white canvas, a helicopter descended from the sky, its blades chopping the silence into noise once more. But inside, Callan didn't hear any of it. He whispered into Arlo's ear, "You're not going to leave me. Not now. You're stronger than this." Arlo blinked slowly. Then he wagged his tail. 3 days after the snowstorm, the world outside the field hospital was still wrapped in white silence. Pine branches sagged under thick snowdrifts, and the only sound near the perimeter fences of the temporary federal base was the hum of space heaters and the occasional bark from a nearby K-9 unit. Inside the medical tent, the air smelled of antiseptic, melting ice, and fur. Arlo lay on a padded table near the rear corner, his side bandaged tightly but his breathing steady. One leg bore an IV drip. His golden brown eyes, dulled by medication but still watchful, tracked every movement in the room. Next to him sat Callan, head resting on his folded arms beside the dog's flank. He hadn't left Arlo's side, not even when Mavis insisted he eat or sleep. No one had the heart to pull him away. Tess stood by the entrance, her arm in a sling, lips pressed into a thin line. She wore a borrowed base jacket and had spent the last 48 hours filing reports, pulling strings, and calling in every favor she'd earned over 15 years of service. Her dark auburn hair had been hastily combed and tucked under a navy beanie, and the exhaustion in her eyes wasn't just from pain. Beside her, Elliot scrolled through a final draft of his exposé. A former war correspondent turned local reporter, he had always believed in small truths, but now, staring at a story that exposed a federal cover-up, a corrupt contractor, and an experimental K-9 program gone rogue, he knew this would change everything. His shoulder still ached from the graze wound, and his coat bore flecks of dried blood, but his focus was clear. "Do you think they'll let him stay?" he asked. Tess didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the approaching footsteps just outside the tent. A woman entered, flanked by 2 agents. She was in her early 50s, short, stocky, and exuded quiet authority. Her name was Director Hallie Brooks, head of Strategic K-9 Operations at the Department of Defense. Her gray suit was impeccable despite the snow outside, and her hair was tightly coiled in a professional bun. She didn't smile, but her eyes flicked first to Arlo, then to Callan. "So this is the boy," she said. Tess stepped forward. "Director Brooks, we filed the appeal per Section 9.4, request for conditional retirement under psychological bond." "I read it," the director replied, "and the supporting testimonies." She removed a tablet from her coat, tapped through several screens. Normally, when a military asset goes dark for over 180 days, especially carrying encrypted payloads, it is recovered, quarantined, and evaluated. Emotionally bonded or not. Callan stirred at the word asset. He looked up slowly, his cheeks red from crying, his voice dry. He's not a thing. He's Arlo. Director Brooks glanced down at him. For a moment, her expression softened. Then Mavis entered, stomping off snow, a thermos of tea in one hand, and her old coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Ma'am," she said curtly, "I'm the boy's grandmother, and I've watched that dog nearly die twice now for my grandson." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Winslow, we're aware of the footage." Elliot stepped forward. "That footage isn't just viral. It's become the heartbeat of a national conversation. A child risking his life to save a service dog abandoned by the very people who trained him. Public sentiment isn't on Cobalt's side." "Public sentiment isn't my mandate," Brooks replied flatly. "Duty is." "Then consider this," Tess said. "Arlo's operational capacity is compromised. His body's broken, his mission's done, the encryption's been extracted, he's not a weapon anymore, he's a survivor." Silence stretched long and cold. Then Brooks exhaled. "We've reviewed the footage, the boy's testimony, Miss Devereaux's history with the program, and Mr. Rhodes's documentation." She turned to Callan. "You understand this dog is technically government property, that we have protocols to follow." Callan's chin trembled, but he nodded. "But he's not just a dog. He's my best friend." Brooks's gaze held his for a long beat. Then she looked at Tess. "Final ruling. Sentinel S7, also known as Arlo, is to be officially retired from active service under Medical Condition Clause 17.2. He will be released into civilian custody to remain with the Winslow family under probationary guardianship. Quarterly health and behavior check-ins are required. Should any aggression or deterioration occur, reassessment will follow." Callan gasped. "So, he can stay?" Brooks allowed the faintest smile. "Yes." The tent filled with quiet noise, relief, joy, exhausted laughter. Mavis wiped at her eyes with her scarf. Elliot let out a breath like he'd been holding it for years. Tess closed her eyes, leaned back against the wall, and whispered, "Finally." Later that day, the sky cleared for the first time in a week. The sun returned, melting the snow just enough to sparkle across the pine branches. Arlo was carefully moved into a medical transport van where Callan could sit beside him for the ride back home. Before they left, Director Brooks pulled Elliot aside. "Your piece, when will it go to print?" "Friday, front page." She nodded. "Make it count." "I will." As the van pulled away, Callan placed his hand gently over Arlo's bandage and whispered, "We're going home now." The new house sat at the edge of Flathead National Forest, where the trees whispered secrets only the wind could carry. It wasn't large, just a single-story log cabin with a sloped tin roof and smoke curling steadily from its stone chimney. But it was warm, sturdy, and wrapped on three sides by a sprawling, fenced yard where the snow piled gently like memory. To Callan Winslow, it felt like a castle. The government relocation team had done its job discreetly. Officially, the cabin belonged to a federal environmental monitoring contractor. In truth, it was a safe haven, far from the shadows of Cobalt systems, buried under layers of anonymity. It came with a new start, a new school, and most importantly, the freedom for one boy and his dog to simply be. It had been 4 weeks since the ruling. Arlo was healing well, though the scar along his flank still throbbed during cold nights. He walked now with only a slight limp, his body filling back into strength with each passing day. His fur had begun to grow over the surgical patch, and his eyes, once darkened with vigilance, now softened when they met Callan's. Callan, now 7, had taken to journaling. Tess had brought him a thick leather-bound notebook, the kind field officers used for mission logs. On the cover, Callan had scrawled in blocky handwriting, "The Book of Arlo." Each evening after dinner, while Mavis worked on a cross-stitch near the fire, Callan sat curled by the hearth and wrote, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes a page. He wrote about the first night Arlo slept on his bed, about how Arlo could sniff out wild mushrooms faster than a truffle pig, about how sometimes he'd wake from a nightmare only to find Arlo already sitting by the door, ears perked, like he'd felt it too. "Write it all down," Elliot had told him during one of his visits. You don't realize how much it matters until you look back. Elliot Rhodes came by every week now, driving 4 hours from Bozeman just to bring donuts, trail maps, or news clippings. His article had gone viral, sparking congressional hearings and freezing Cobalt Systems contracts indefinitely. For a man who once wrote high school football recaps, it had launched him onto a national stage. But he still preferred coffee at Mavis's kitchen table, Arlo's head under his hand, and Callan's endless questions about satellites and secret codes. Elliot had also helped them set up a satellite connection at the cabin, allowing Callan to take part in a small remote learning program with kids from across the country. One of the instructors, a kind-eyed woman named Miss Rowe, encouraged Callan to read his journal entries aloud during writing time. She was in her early 30s, always wore beaded earrings, and spoke with a southern lilt. Words, she'd said during their first virtual session, are like maps. They lead us back to who we are. Mavis, meanwhile, had rediscovered her own strength. She gardened again, despite the frost, and baked apple pies that filled the house with spice. Her hair remained tied in the same thick bun, streaks of silver tucked into each twist. Her once skeptical view of Arlo had shifted entirely. Every morning she fed him a sliver of bacon, muttering, "Don't tell the vet." As for Tess, she visited only once since the move, but when she came, it was with news. "They're disbanding Project Hermes," she'd said over coffee, standing beside the same fireplace where Callan now journaled. The data from Arlo's collar confirmed too much. They're repurposing the K9 division, stripping out the autonomy layers. She had looked at Arlo for a long time before kneeling beside him. "They'll never make another dog like you," she said, "and maybe that's a good thing." Callan had been quiet, staring at the fire. But what if the world needs more dogs like him? Tess had smiled. "Then we make the world safer, so we don't." That afternoon, before she left, she gave Callan a small metal tag, Arlo's original unit insignia, battered but intact. "He won't need this anymore. Maybe you will." Now, each evening Callan wore it like a necklace under his shirt, a quiet reminder of everything they'd survived. One morning in late February, the snow began to melt. Callan stood at the edge of the yard in his heavy coat and wool gloves, watching Arlo bound clumsily through the last piles of snow. The dog's breath steamed in the air, tongue lolling with joy. It was the first time he had run without pain since the cabin attack. Callan opened his notebook and wrote, "Today Arlo ran like the storm never touched him. Maybe that means the storm is finally over for me too." Inside, Mavis opened the window just enough to call out, "Don't forget lunch, sweetheart." Callan turned. "5 more minutes." Arlo barked once in agreement, circling back to nudge the boy's leg. They stayed that way for a while, boy and dog, standing side by side beneath the thinning clouds, until the wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. It smelled like a beginning. In a world where cruelty can lurk behind uniforms and betrayal hides behind polished glass, a 6-year-old boy taught us what true courage looks like. Not the kind made of medals or titles, but the courage to kneel on a cold bridge and reach for a life that others had given up on. Callan didn't save Arlo because he had to. He saved him because it was right. And in that simple, fearless act, something miraculous happened. Not just a rescue, but a resurrection. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a whisper from God reminding us that no life is too broken to be loved, and no bond too unlikely to be sacred. Arlo wasn't just a dog. He was an answer to a boy's loneliness, to a grandmother's fear, to a world that sometimes forgets how much kindness matters. So, if this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Who have you reached out to lately? Who is hanging by a thread, waiting for someone to care? We are all bridges for each other, and sometimes it takes a child and a wounded dog to show us how to cross. If you believe in second chances, if you believe love can heal even the deepest scars, if you believe God sends angels in 4-legged forms, comment Amen below. Share this story. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life miracles. May God bless you and all the silent heroes out there.